They laughed when I asked about my room. Guess the lobby's your bed tonight, Grandma. That's what the text said, no emoji, no apology, just those words blinking at me beneath the golden chandelier of the Grand Marlowe Hotel. I sat there with my coat folded neatly on my lap, like I had been taught to wait with grace, even when being humiliated. Adjusted? I repeated, my voice more air than sound. By whom? He hesitated. It shows the modification was done by Mr. Michael Moore. For a moment, I didn't understand what that meant. My son. My own son. The boy who once built me a Mother's Day card out of popsicle sticks and glue. I thought maybe it was an error, a computer glitch, a misunderstanding. Could you check again? I asked softly. He nodded, fingers tapping, Polita, detached. Yes, ma'am. When I brought her coffee, she looked up and said, You remind me of my grandmother. She passed last year. I smiled gently. Then I'll take that as a compliment. She nodded, eyes wet. She used to say the same thing you just said to that man, that good coffee solves half of life's problems. Only half? I teased. The other half's kindness. I laughed softly. Then your grandmother was a wise woman. She smiled, and for a moment, I saw Clara's face in hers, the same spark, the same tender uncertainty about the world. It struck me then that life has a funny way of giving you back what you thought you'd lost, just not always in the form you expect. When my shift ended, I walked home with the setting sun at my back. The world glowed amber, and the leaves crunched under my shoes. Every step felt deliberate, chosen. At home, Ruth was sitting on the porch with her crossword and a glass of lemonade. You look content, she said. I am, I replied. For the first time in a long time. Good, she said. You've earned it. I sat beside her, and we watched the street in comfortable silence. Children rode bicycles. Neighbors carried groceries. A man walked his dog. Life unfolded gently around us. After a while, Ruth said, You know what I think? I think peace doesn't come when everything's fine. It comes when you stop expecting anyone else to make it so. I turned to her. That might be the wisest thing I've ever heard. She smirked. Don't act surprised. We both laughed, the kind of laugh that lingers real, unhurried, alive. Later that night, I stood at my window and looked out over the quiet street. The wind chime on Ruth's porch tinkled softly, its sound carrying into my room. I thought of my old life, the marble floors of that hotel, the messages that once decided my worth. They felt like ghosts now, distant and powerless. I whispered into the dark, I forgive you, Michael. I forgive you, Samantha. The words weren't for them, they were for me. Forgiveness wasn't about reopening the door, it was about closing it without anger. I opened my journal and wrote one final entry for the night. I have learned to live without waiting. I have learned that the absence of love can still be filled with purpose, with peace, with self. Then I closed the notebook, placed it on my bedside table, and turned off the light. The darkness didn't frighten me anymore. It felt like rest. If you had told me a year ago that peace could come after being left in a hotel lobby, I wouldn't have believed you. I thought healing required apologies, explanations, some kind of closure shaped like love. But I was wrong. Healing came quietly through early mornings at the diner, through the rhythm of ordinary kindness, through laughter shared with a woman who asked for nothing in return. It came when I stopped chasing rooms where I was never meant to stay. I am 80 years old now, and I live in a small upstairs room that smells faintly of coffee and old books. I walk to work each day. I read poetry in the evenings. I plant small pots of lavender on the porch and hum while I water them. There's nothing grand about my life, but it is mine, entirely mine. Every hour, every breath, every decision belongs to me again. Sometimes I think about that night at the Grand Marlowe, the chandelier, the marble floors, the text that told me to sleep in the lobby. It doesn't sting anymore. It feels like a story that happened to someone I used to know, a woman who still believed her worth depended on being chosen. I look back on her with compassion. She waited for love that never arrived. She sat still, hoping to be seen, and when no one came, she stood up and walked into her own future. If you're listening to this, maybe you know a version of that woman. Maybe you are her. Maybe you've spent too long waiting for an invitation, for someone to notice your absence, for a door to open that keeps closing. I want you to know this. You don't need anyone's permission to start again. You can leave the table. You can find another chair. You can sit alone and still be whole. Sometimes freedom begins in the smallest ways: a packed suitcase, a bus ticket, a letter you decide not to send. Sometimes it's as simple as saying no and meaning it. I once thought losing my family was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I see it was the beginning of being found. So, if this story reached you, if it touched something quiet and aching inside, then stay a little while longer. I'm afraid the change was processed at 8:30 this morning. The Moore party has 3 rooms under their account, all occupied. He gave me a careful look, the kind reserved for people on the verge of embarrassment. Would you like to contact them? I pulled out my phone, my hands trembling slightly. I sent a message to Samantha. I'm here at the hotel. Something seems wrong with my room. Should I wait in the lobby? 5 minutes passed. Let it remind you that there's life after invisibility, light after rejection, and a kind of joy that doesn't need witnesses. Thank you for listening to my story. If you believe in second chances, in the strength of quiet women, and in the beauty of starting over, stay with us. Subscribe, listen, and keep walking toward your own healing. Because sometimes, the most powerful story you'll ever tell is the one where you finally choose yourself. I sat down near the tall potted orchids and folded my coat over my knees the way I'd done 1,000 times before in waiting rooms and airports. Then her reply arrived. "Oh, Evelyn, we had to make a few last-minute changes. Space got tight. Just hang in the lobby for now. Maybe ask if they have couches. We'll find you later." No apology, no explanation. Just words that landed like stones in water, rippling through everything I thought I knew about my place in their world. I read it 3 times. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't respond. I didn't want to sound angry. Old women aren't supposed to be angry. It makes people uncomfortable. We're expected to smile through the sting. So, I smiled. I told the clerk I'd wait. He looked relieved, as if I'd saved him from having to witness my humiliation. The lobby was grand, too grand, with chairs that looked comfortable but weren't meant for sitting long. I chose one near the window, deep red velvet that swallowed my frame. My feet didn't reach the floor. I set my small suitcase by my legs and clasped my hands together, pretending I had somewhere to be. An hour passed, then another. I told myself they were busy, that maybe Samantha was handling guests or that Michael was caught in traffic. I refused to let my mind wander to darker places. I thought about Clara instead, about how, when she was 5, she used to crawl into my lap with a book of fairy tales and say, "Tell it the grandma way." I would change the endings, give villains redemption, let lost girls find themselves, let every lonely heart be seen. Funny how I could rewrite everyone's story but my own. By evening, the hotel grew louder. Music drifted from the bar. Guests swept past in perfume and laughter. The concierge smiled at every passing soul. None of them looked like they'd ever been forgotten. At 7, I checked my phone again. Nothing. Not from Samantha. Not from Michael. Not from Clara. I stared at the glowing screen until it dimmed into black. When the concierge finally approached, his tone was soft. "Ma'am, are you still waiting for your party?" "Yes," I whispered. He frowned. "They've already checked in, I believe. Would you like me to call their room?" I shook my head. "No, that's all right." He offered me a blanket. I declined. Dignity felt like the only thing I had left, and I wasn't ready to hand it over. That's when something shifted inside me. Not a break, but a quiet tilt, like the world had realigned without my permission. I understood then that I wasn't waiting for them anymore. I was waiting for myself, though I didn't know it yet. The chandelier above me sparkled coldly, catching in my eyes as I looked up. I thought about how every family has its unspoken rule. The one person expected to bear the weight of silence. I had played that role for decades, through their fights, through their ambitions, through the years of being helpful instead of human. Now, I sat in the lobby of a hotel I had paid for, a guest in a story I'd written but was no longer invited to read. When I finally stood to stretch my legs, I saw my reflection in the mirrored wall, an old woman in a tidy cardigan, posture straight, face calm. You wouldn't know by looking that she had just been erased. I almost laughed. Because that's the thing about being dismissed quietly, it gives you time to hear your own thoughts. And my thoughts, that night, were louder than they had been in years. That was the beginning. Not the pain yet that would come later, but the first tremor before the quake. I didn't know then that this night would split my life clean in half, the before when I still believed I belonged, and the after when I stopped asking for proof. Stay with me, this story might change how you see everything. My name is Evelyn Grace Moore, and I'm 80 years old. I live alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a florist shop in Asheville, North Carolina. The mornings smell like coffee and roses because the scent drifts up through the vents. The moment when I stopped believing that love and belonging were the same thing. The evenings stretched long and slow, the kind of time that doesn't move but presses against you, reminding you that you're still waiting. By 8 o'clock, my back ached from sitting upright for so many hours. My shoes, the sensible pair I'd worn to seem put together, had begun to pinch. Still, I stayed there in that red velvet chair, pretending I had a purpose for being there beyond not wanting to be seen as a woman left behind. At 8:15, I finally stood and walked to the front desk again. The young clerk from earlier had gone home. In his place stood a woman, maybe in her 40s, polished but kind-eyed. Her name tag read, Bennett. "Excuse me," I said softly, keeping my voice steady. "I was told my reservation was canceled. My family, the Moore party, is checked in. I'd just like to confirm it wasn't some mistake." She typed on her keyboard, the click of each key sounding like a small verdict. Then she looked up, sympathy already forming in her eyes before she even spoke. "Mrs. Moore, I do see that the Moore party has 3 suites checked in under Mr. Michael Moore's name. There's no additional room listed." There it was. No misunderstanding, no system glitch, no waiting left to do. I nodded, as if I had expected the answer all along. "Thank you," I said. My voice was too calm to be natural. She hesitated. "Would you like to reach them through the room line?" "I can—" "No," I interrupted, shaking my head gently. "They know I'm here." I turned away before I could see pity fill her face. Pity has a weight to it, heavier than cruelty, because it reminds you of your smallness. I didn't want to be looked at like that. I walked toward the restroom near the gift shop, my suitcase trailing behind me. I locked myself in a stall, sat down, and stared at the tiled floor. I wasn't crying, tears require energy, and mine was gone. I simply needed somewhere to exist without being watched. It's strange how public restrooms become safe places for women like me. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the faint smell of soap and perfume. It's a sort of neutral zone where no one expects anything of you. I looked at my reflection in the metal partition, distorted and dull. I whispered quietly, "You're still here, Evelyn. Don't disappear now." After a while, I stood, fixed my hair, reapplied lipstick, and went back to the lobby. The night crowd had thickened. Couples in pressed suits, women in silk dresses, laughter that came too easily. The kind of laughter people use to prove they belong. I sat again, same chair, same angle facing the chandelier, my suitcase by my feet, my phone silent beside me. At 9:30, it buzzed. My heart leapt before I could stop it. A message from Samantha. Everything's sorted. Don't worry. No mention of me. No offer to come down. Just two sentences that confirmed what I already knew. They had moved on, comfortably, upstairs, maybe even toasting to family while I sat below like forgotten luggage. I read the message once, twice, then deleted it. The screen went dark. I stared at my hands, veins thin, as threads beneath skin the color of faded ivory. They'd held babies, cooked meals, signed permission slips, typed resignation letters. They'd built a life. And yet here they were, folded neatly, useless in a place that didn't want them. For the first time in years, I felt something hot rise in my chest. Not sadness, not fear, but anger. Not wild, not loud, but pure. The kind that comes from realizing you've spent decades making yourself smaller to fit someone else's comfort. I sat with that feeling for a long while. It felt foreign, but right. By 10 o'clock, the crowd had thinned. The soft jazz from the piano near the bar played to an empty room. A janitor mopped the marble floor quietly. That's when I noticed a man standing by the reception counter, Mr. Bennett again, now without the blazer, his sleeves rolled up. He was speaking softly to a bellboy, then turned toward me. He walked over slowly, not with authority, but with gentleness. "Mrs. Moore?" I nodded. "Yes? I heard about what happened," he said. "I'm the night manager here. I just wanted to make sure you're all right." "All right?" I repeated with a small laugh that surprised even me. "I suppose that depends on your definition." He didn't smile. He didn't rush to comfort me either. And somehow that was better. I start each day the same way: 1 cup of chamomile tea, 2 small white pills, and a quiet look out the window at the world that seems to hurry faster than I can think. But this story isn't about the life I have now. It's about the night I realized how easily a family can make you invisible. It started 3 months ago when my granddaughter, Clara, called to tell me she was engaged. Her voice was bright, full of that youthful sparkle that used to make me smile even through a bad day. "Would you come with me for a moment?" I hesitated, then followed. We stepped into the elevator, the polished metal walls reflecting two people from different worlds. An old woman holding her coat close, and a man trying not to look like he was rescuing her. He pressed the top button. "PH, penthouse level." I looked at him. "There's a mistake," I said. He shook his head gently. "No, ma'am, there's not." When the doors opened, I stepped into a silence that felt like air after rain, fresh, startling, almost holy. The suite was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the city skyline, lights blinking like constellations of every story I'd ever told myself about being loved. "It's yours," he said simply. "No charge. We had a last-minute cancellation, and I'd rather see it used." I stared at him, unable to move. "Why?" I whispered. He met my eyes. "Because no one should be left where you were sitting." I didn't thank him right away. Gratitude felt too small for what he'd given me. It wasn't charity. It was something rarer: recognition. After he left, I stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence. It wasn't the lonely kind I'd known for years, the kind that hums with absence. This silence had weight, presence. It filled the space instead of hollowing it out. I didn't unpack. I didn't even take off my shoes. I sat on the edge of the bed, ran my hand across the white comforter, and tried to remember the last time someone had looked at me and seen more than obligation. The lights of the city stretched endlessly below, tiny and alive. Somewhere down there, my family slept soundly, unbothered, maybe already rewriting the story in their heads. Mom must have canceled. She probably got confused. We offered her a couch, after all. They would tell themselves anything to make the cruelty sound logistical. I turned off my phone, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I didn't need another message that started with, "Sorry, but..." The room had a small grand piano near the window. I hadn't touched a piano since my wedding day. My fingers trembled as I pressed one key. The sound filled the air softly, like a whisper of the person I'd been before all the silencing. For the first time in years, I felt visible, even if only to myself. That night, I sat in the armchair by the window, watching headlights snake through the streets far below. I didn't sleep. I just breathed, slowly, deliberately, like someone learning how to, again. And somewhere in that quiet, I made a small, silent promise. If no one else will open the door for me, I'll learn how to build my own. I didn't yet know how that promise would change everything, but I knew it was the first real thing I'd said to myself in decades. The first morning in the penthouse felt unreal. The sun poured through the enormous windows in gold sheets, settling softly on the bedspread like a warm hand. For a long time, I didn't move. I was afraid that if I did, the world would correct itself, that I'd wake up back in the lobby chair with my coat in my lap and that hollow ache in my chest. But the world stayed still. I was here on the top floor of a hotel that had never meant for someone like me to sleep in its best room. I walked barefoot across the marble floor, my feet making soft sounds that echoed just enough to remind me I was not invisible anymore. In the kitchenette, I found a small coffee machine and a packet of roasted beans. I brewed a cup, inhaled deeply, and took the first sip standing near the window. The city spread out beneath me, a map of motion, tiny cars, specks of people, smoke rising from rooftops. It all looked smaller from up here, even my pain. I sat at the glass table, wrapped my hands around the mug, and let my thoughts untangle. For 80 years, my life had been about attending to needs, to people, to the roles I was expected to play: wife, mother, grandmother, the woman who made things run smoothly but was never the one anyone waited for. Now, for the first time, there was no one to serve, no one to adjust for. The silence around me wasn't empty, it was full. Full of possibilities that had waited decades for me to stop apologizing for wanting them. I thought about leaving immediately, about calling a taxi and finding a modest motel. But then I heard the echo of Mr. Freisting. Bennett's words, "Because no one should be left where you were." He hadn't said it as pity, but as truth, and it felt wrong to reject that truth by running. So I stayed. That day, I didn't unpack, but I explored. Every corner of that penthouse seemed like a world of its own. "Grandma, you have to come. We're having a weekend celebration at the Grand Marlowe downtown. Everyone will be there." I had laughed softly, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Everyone. I had assumed that meant me too. I spent weeks preparing. I bought a new dress, simple, navy blue with pearl buttons. Nothing extravagant, just respectable. A grand piano, untouched but polished to a mirror shine. A vase of fresh lilies on the counter, still dripping with morning dew. A balcony with glass railings where the city hummed faintly below. I stepped outside and felt the wind tug gently at my hair. It wasn't the kind of view that heals you immediately. It was the kind that reminds you you're still alive to be healed. Around noon, I ordered room service, not because I was hungry, but because I wanted to experience the small decadence of being cared for. A young waiter brought up a tray chicken soup, warm bread, and a slice of lemon cake. "Enjoy your meal, ma'am," he said, eyes polite but curious. "Thank you," I replied. And I meant it in ways he could never understand. I ate slowly, savoring each bite like a ceremony. It wasn't about the food. It was about belonging to myself, to the moment, to the quiet act of being seen. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, I sat at the piano. My fingers hovered above the keys. I hadn't played since my husband Thomas passed away 20 years ago. Music had always been ours, a language we spoke fluently in our small living room when words failed us. My hands trembled as they touched the keys, stiff from years of neglect. I pressed one note, then another. The melody stumbled at first, uncertain, then found its footing. It was an old tune, Blue Moon, the song Thomas used to hum when we danced in the kitchen. My eyes filled before I could stop them. The sound of the piano felt like light leaking into a place long closed. I wasn't crying for loss anymore. I was crying for rediscovery. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I was restless, but because the silence in that suite was the kind of quiet I'd never allowed myself before. It wasn't loneliness, it was liberation disguised as stillness. I sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath me, reading a book I found on the shelf, The Collected Poems of Mary Oliver. Her words wrapped around me like prayer. Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew the question had finally reached me. The next morning, I woke early, just as the city began to stir. I made coffee again, opened the balcony doors, and breathed in the cold air. It smelled faintly of rain and exhaust and the faint promise of change. I looked down at the streets, at the taxis lining up in crooked rows, at strangers rushing toward their destinations. I realized how strange it was to feel more connected to those strangers than to my own family. Maybe because strangers expect nothing from you, they don't rewrite your story to fit their comfort. They just pass through it, briefly, and let you be. I thought about Clara then, my sweet granddaughter, the one with the laugh that sounded like wind chimes. She hadn't texted or called, but I remembered the way she used to look at me when she was small, like I was her favorite person in the world. I wondered if she even knew what had happened downstairs, or if her parents had told her I'd changed my mind about coming. I hoped, selfishly, that some part of her had looked around that night and noticed my absence. I spent the day in quiet rituals. I brushed my hair, laid out my dress on the bed, and smoothed the wrinkles with my hands. I poured another cup of coffee and wrote a small note on the hotel stationery. Thank you, Mr. Bennett, for reminding me that kindness still exists. I left it on the nightstand. By late afternoon, I made my decision. I wouldn't attend the engagement dinner, not out of spite, but because I finally understood something that had taken a lifetime to learn. Sometimes love requires distance to survive. They didn't need another smiling photograph of me pretending everything was fine. They needed to feel my absence, to realize what it meant. So I stayed in that room as the night fell again. I watched the city lights flicker on, one by one, like small acts of defiance against the dark. I poured myself a glass of water, sat on the couch, and whispered, "You did enough, Evelyn." The next day, I packed my things carefully. I folded each blouse with deliberate patience, as if I were tucking away a version of myself that had served its time. I placed my small gift for Clara, a book of poems, tied with a silver ribbon on the desk. I didn't write a note. Some gifts speak for themselves. Before leaving, I took one last walk through the suite. The piano, the window. I had even gone to the salon for a trim and asked the stylist to curl my hair the way I used to wear it when my late husband, Thomas, would take me dancing. "You look lovely, Mrs. Moore," she said. "Got a date?" I smiled and told her, "Something better. Family." That word used to mean safety to me. Now it feels more like a test I keep failing. My son Michael and his wife Samantha live in Atlanta, a few hours away. They're both professionals, sharp, successful, efficient, the chair where I'd sat and rediscovered my pulse. Every object felt like a witness to something sacred, the birth of self-worth in a woman who had long mistaken silence for grace. I didn't call the front desk. I didn't seek out Mr. Bennett. Some gratitude doesn't need an audience. I simply left the key card on the counter and wheeled my suitcase to the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored wall. My eyes were tired, but steady, my shoulders square, my coat buttoned to the top. When I reached the lobby, no one looked up. And for once, that didn't hurt. I walked out of the Grand Marlowe Hotel into the cold morning light, pulling my suitcase behind me. The city buzzed around me alive, uncaring, magnificent. I took a deep breath and stepped into the current of it. I didn't have a plan, only an instinct to keep moving. I passed a small cafe with fogged windows and the smell of cinnamon wafting through the door. I went inside, ordered a cup of coffee and a buttered croissant, and took a seat by the window. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes and a chipped name tag that read Rosa, smiled softly when she brought my plate. "Rough morning?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, "but it's getting better." She nodded like she understood. I sat there for a long time, watching people come and go. The clatter of cups, the low hum of conversation. It all felt real in a way the past 2 days hadn't. When I finished, I pulled a small notebook from my purse. On the first blank page, I wrote, "You are no longer waiting to be invited in." I underlined it twice. Outside, the world kept spinning, cars honking, people rushing, life unbothered. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to join it. Not as a forgotten mother, not as someone's afterthought, but as Evelyn Grace Moore, a woman learning, finally, how to take up space. I left the hotel with the kind of calm that only comes after surviving humiliation. Not triumph, not joy, just stillness. The kind that feels like the first breath after being underwater too long. The sky above Asheville that morning was pale and gentle, a thin layer of clouds softening the light. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay near that lobby any longer. My suitcase wheels clicked rhythmically against the sidewalk as I walked. People passed me by, young couples, business travelers, a man walking a dog that looked far too happy for such an early hour. No one looked twice, and for once, I didn't mind being unseen. There's a freedom in invisibility when it's on your own terms. After 2 blocks, I stopped in front of a cafe with a chalkboard sign that read "Breakfast served all day." The windows were fogged from the warmth inside. I stepped in, grateful for the smell of bacon and coffee, for the murmur of voices that didn't know my name. I sat in a booth near the back, my coat folded beside me, my suitcase tucked beneath the table. The waitress, mid-30s, hair tied back in a messy bun, name tag crooked, approached with a soft smile. "Good morning, Honorable. What can I get you?" "Just coffee," I said. Then, after a pause, "And maybe some toast." She nodded and disappeared toward the kitchen. I watched the steam rise from the cup when she returned. The heat against my palms was comforting, grounding. It reminded me of the mornings Thomas and I used to share before work, when life felt manageable and the future still held promise. I stayed there for nearly an hour. I didn't rush. I watched the door open and close, the rhythm of lives happening all around me. When I finally asked for the check, I noticed a small corkboard on the wall near the restroom. It was cluttered with flyers, dog walking, piano lessons, used furniture. One caught my eye. "Room for rent, quiet lady preferred. $400 divided by month. Near bus line. Call Ruth." The paper was old, the edges curled, written in neat block letters that felt trustworthy. I jotted down the number on a napkin, paid my bill in cash, and stepped outside into the crisp air. At the payphone outside a laundromat, I dialed. A voice answered after 2 rings, gruff, suspicious. "Yeah? Hi," I said. "I'm calling about the room. My name's Evelyn Moore." "How old are you?" the woman asked bluntly. 80, I said. There was a pause. "You clean?" "Yes." "No boyfriends, no drama?" I almost laughed. "Not for 40 years. Another pause. Then, "Come by at 4. 219 Pinehurst Avenue. Bring cash for the first week. Click. The line went dead. I folded the napkin, tucked it into my coat pocket, and smiled to myself. They send me polite Christmas cards, birthday calls that last under 3 minutes, and occasional emails that start with, "Hope you're well." I have learned to read between the lines of their busyness. They love me in the way people love something fragile kept on a shelf, admired occasionally, but not to be touched too often. Still, I wanted to believe I mattered. So when the invitation came, gold-trimmed and embossed with Clara's initials, I didn't hesitate. There was something strangely invigorating about being given a list of simple conditions. Clean, quiet, cash. It felt like the beginning of a new equation, one that finally added up to me. I spent the next few hours wandering. I walked through small shops, touched scarves I didn't need, browsed postcards I would never send. For once, I wasn't hurrying to meet someone else's schedule. I existed entirely in my own time. At exactly 4, I stood in front of a small blue house with peeling paint and a wind chime made from old silver spoons. A tabby cat slept on the porch railing, tail flicking lazily. I knocked twice. The door opened to reveal a stout woman in her 60s with a head of unruly gray curls and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You the old lady?" she asked. "I suppose I am," I said, smiling faintly. "Good. Come in." The living room smelled faintly of lavender and fried onions. The furniture was mismatched, the walls lined with faded photographs of people I didn't know. "Room's upstairs," she said, climbing the creaky staircase ahead of me. 100 a week. No guests, no noise. You pay on Fridays. You cause problems, you leave. "Clear?" "Crystal," I said. She turned to look at me then, really look, her eyes softening just a little. "Name's Ruth. You hungry?" I could eat. Good. I hate eating alone. That was how it began. The room was small but clean, a twin bed, a dresser, a window that faced a narrow alley where the afternoon light slanted through dust. I unpacked slowly, placing each folded blouse into the drawer as if tucking in old friends. On the nightstand, I set down a single photograph of Clara at age 7, grinning with a popsicle in her hand. After a moment, I put it back in the drawer. Not yet. That evening, Ruth made grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. We ate at the tiny kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator our background music. She didn't ask about my family, and I didn't offer. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was respectful. The kind of silence shared by people who have survived their own storms and no longer need to narrate them. Later, when she went to bed, I stood at the window of my new room. The streetlight outside flickered against the cracked paint of the houses across the street. Somewhere, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a radio played faintly from an open window. I felt neither lonely nor afraid, just settled. That night, I slept better than I had in years. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The air smelled of coffee and rain. Ruth was already in the kitchen, frying something that sizzled pleasantly in the pan. "There's a diner 2 blocks down," she said without looking up. "They got a help wanted sign. You look like you can still move around." I smiled. "I can." "Then go." So I did. The diner was small, the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other. The bell above the door chimed as I entered. Behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with fraying apron strings and tired eyes looked up. "Morning," she said. "You looking for coffee or work?" "Work," I answered. She squinted at me. "You ever waited tables?" "No," I said. "But I've raised 3 children, managed a household, cared for a husband through illness, and hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 30 people without losing my mind." She snorted. "That'll do. Come back tomorrow, 6 a.m. Trial shift." I left smiling. That night, I ironed my blouse, the one with the lace collar. I hadn't worn it since Thomas's memorial, but it still made me feel dignified. I sat on the edge of the bed, the photograph of Clara in my hand. "You'd laugh at me, kiddo," I whispered. "Grandma, the waitress." But I wasn't ashamed. Not even a little. The next morning, I started work. Ruth had left coffee on the stove for me. "Don't spill it," she said gruffly, which I later learned meant good luck. At the diner, the air smelled of syrup and sizzling bacon. The owner, her name was Marge, handed me a stained apron and said, "Let's see what you got." The first few hours were a blur of coffee pots, orders, and greetings. My feet ached. My hands trembled when I carried plates. But no one laughed. In fact, a man at the counter, gray beard and kind eyes, said, "You move like you've done this forever." I smiled. Maybe I have, just not for money. By noon, I'd learned to balance 3 plates on one arm and refill a coffee cup without spilling a drop. When my shift ended, Marge nodded approvingly. "You're decent at this." I booked the suite myself under my name. I told no one. I wanted it to be a surprise, a small gesture to show that I could still take care of myself. I paid with what was left from the savings Thomas and I had built money I'd been keeping for emergencies. Foolishly, I thought love qualified. The day I flew in, I wore my best coat, soft gray wool with large round buttons, and the leather shoes that always pinch my right heel after walking too long. "Be here at 6 tomorrow. Don't be late." "I won't," I said. I walked back to Ruth's with sore legs and a full heart. She was sitting on the porch, reading a newspaper. "You survive?" she asked. "Barely," I said. She grinned. "Good. That means it's honest work." That evening, we ate dinner together again. Fried potatoes and onions this time. The house smelled like home. Not mine, but home nonetheless. After dinner, I sat at the small desk in my room and opened my notebook. On a fresh page, I wrote, "Today I earned my place without asking for permission." I underlined it twice. Over the next weeks, my life took on rhythm. Work in the morning, rest in the afternoon, quiet evenings with Ruth. I learned how to make perfect coffee, how to recognize regulars by their orders, how to smile without apologizing for taking up space. Sometimes, I'd see families come in mothers, fathers, daughters, laughing over pancakes. I watched them with a kind of detached tenderness. Not envy, just awareness. I'd once been part of that tableau. Now, I was something else, someone watching, learning, healing. And in that small diner, surrounded by clinking dishes and the hum of ordinary life, I began to remember who I was before I became who they needed me to be. The days at Ruth's house began to stretch into something gentle, something almost musical in their rhythm. Mornings smelled of coffee and frying onions. Evenings hummed softly with the creak of old wood and the whir of ceiling fans. My life had become quiet, but not hollow steady, like a song that doesn't demand to be heard but fills the room all the same. Every morning, I walked to the diner in my lace-collared blouse and sensible shoes. By 6:30, the regulars were already waiting. Mr. Daniels with his black coffee and crossword, the young couple who always split pancakes, the tired nurse from the hospital down the street. I greeted them by name, learned how they took their coffee, and listened to their stories. It's funny how strangers will pour their hearts into the ears of someone who doesn't judge. Maybe that's what I'd always been good at, listening, holding other people's noise until they could breathe again. But this time, I was being paid for it, and somehow that made it feel fair. The first few weeks were hard on my body. My knees ached, my back protested every time I bent to wipe a table. But each night when I came home, there was a satisfaction in the ache, as if my body was reminding me it still had purpose. Ruth never asked about my day, and I never felt the need to tell her. We understood each other without needing to fill the air. Sometimes, after dinner, she'd hum softly while washing dishes. She had a beautiful, rough-edged voice, the kind that carried both heartbreak and humor. One night, she caught me listening. "You like old songs?" she asked. "I like anything that remembers," I said. She nodded. "Then we'll get along." And we did. Weeks turned into months. The seasons began to change. Autumn brushed the city with color, and I found myself walking to the library on my afternoons off. The smell of old paper was like time itself breathing. I borrowed journals, poetry collections, and books on birds. I started to write again small thoughts at first, scribbled between coffee orders and grocery lists. I am learning to exist without permission. Peace doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes it's the sound of your own footsteps. Each line felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. Sometimes I'd sit at the diner counter after my shift ended, watching the door, half expecting to see my son or daughter-in-law walk in. They never did, of course. I had become a ghost in their story, the inconvenient reminder they preferred to leave unmentioned. Still, there were moments when I caught my reflection in the chrome coffee machine, hair pinned neatly, lipstick faded, apron slightly wrinkled, and I thought, this woman looks alive, and that was enough. Then, one Wednesday morning, something changed. I returned from my shift to find an envelope slid beneath my door. My name was typed neatly on the front, Evelyn Grace Moore, in the kind of formal font that only people who have forgotten how to be personal choose. I recognized it immediately. Samantha's stationery. Thick paper, cream-colored, elegant in that way that felt more like armor than beauty. I sat down on the bed, the envelope heavy in my hand. Ruth's footsteps creaked faintly in the hallway, then faded. I was alone. I turned the envelope over once, twice, and finally opened it. I landed early, checked my bag, and took a taxi to the hotel. The Grand Marlowe was elegant in the way that only places built to impress strangers can be: polished marble floors, brass railings, an endless chandelier that hung like liquid sunlight. I felt small but proud, like a visitor stepping into her own story again. The young man at the front desk smiled when I handed him my ID. "Welcome, Mrs. Moore. Checking in?" "Yes, dear." Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no warmth, just words. "Dear Evelyn, we'd like to apologize for the miscommunication at the hotel. We were under the impression you wouldn't be attending the engagement weekend. Clara was very disappointed not to see you. We hope to make it right before the wedding. Invitations will be sent soon. Please let us know where you're currently living so we can include you. Best, Michael and Samantha, asterisk." No acknowledgement of what had really happened. No mention of the hours I sat in that lobby, of the message that told me to crash in the lobby. Just bureaucratic politeness, a tidy attempt to sweep cruelty under civility. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the dresser. I didn't cry, I didn't rage. I just stared at it until the words blurred into meaninglessness. Later, at dinner, Ruth noticed my silence. "You okay?" she asked, spooning mashed potatoes onto her plate. "Fine," I said automatically. She glanced at me over her glasses. "You're lying, but I respect that." That made me smile. After dinner, I returned to my room, sat at my desk, and wrote a reply. Not immediately. I let the words come in their own time. When they did, they were simple. "Dear Michael, thank you for the letter. I will not be attending the wedding. Please give Clara my love. I hope her life is filled with joy and that she learns to speak her truth without fear. Evelyn asterisk. No bitterness, no explanations. Just truth, stripped clean of performance." I left the letter on the nightstand for 3 days before mailing it. I wanted to see if my resolve would falter. It didn't. On the 4th day, I walked to the post office, stood in line between a man mailing birthday cards and a woman sending a parcel wrapped in brown paper, and I slipped my letter into the outgoing box. It was a small, quiet act, but I felt the ground shift beneath me. That evening, I didn't tell Ruth. Some victories are meant to be kept private, held like a secret flame. Instead, I made tea and opened my notebook. On a fresh page, I wrote, I am no longer waiting to be forgiven for existing. I stared at the words until they no longer felt like something I'd written, but something I had become. Days passed. The air grew colder. One morning, frost laced the windows of the diner. As I poured coffee for a customer, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass, older, yes, but no longer shrinking. I realized then that I had stopped apologizing with my body. I stood straighter. My voice didn't tremble when I spoke. That evening, I treated myself to a small indulgence. After work, I went to the thrift store on the corner. The place smelled of dust and old perfume. I browsed the racks until I found it a long gray wool coat with deep pockets and sturdy buttons. It wasn't new, but it was warm and elegant in its simplicity. When I tried it on, I saw myself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. She looked complete. Not beautiful, not youthful, but present. I bought the coat and wore it home. The air outside bit at my cheeks, but the coat held me like armor. When I entered Ruth's kitchen, she looked up from her crossword. New coat? Yes, I said, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders. Looks like it was waiting for you. Maybe it was. That night, I wrote one last line before bed. I have stopped asking for doors to open. I'm learning to build my own. It was the truest sentence I'd ever written. It was a Sunday morning when the past found its way back to me, not through a phone call or a letter this time, but through something smaller, a postcard. I found it tucked beneath the door of my room, its corners slightly bent, its front showing a watercolor of wildflowers and the words, "Thinking of you." The handwriting was familiar the moment I saw it curved and looping, a little too large for the small card. Glada. My hands trembled as I turned it over. Graham, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened at the hotel. They said you weren't coming. I wish you had been there. I miss you. Love, Glada. There was no return address, no number, just those words, brief, raw, real. I sat on the bed for a long time, the card pressed against my chest. Outside, I could hear Ruth in the kitchen, the faint hiss of her frying pan, the radio playing some old blues tune. Life, as always, went on. But in that moment, I let myself feel everything, the ache, the forgiveness, the quiet pride that Clara had written it all. The reservation should be under Evelyn Moore 1 suite for the Moore family party. He typed quickly, his smile fading as his eyes darted across the screen. It looks like your reservation was canceled this morning. I blinked. That can't be right. I made it myself. He scrolled again, lowered his voice politely. It says the group booking under the Moore party was adjusted. Your name's no longer attached to any active room. My stomach tightened. She had broken free, even if just a little, from the narrative her parents had crafted. I didn't write back. Not because I didn't want to, but because her words were enough. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is to let a moment stand untouched. That afternoon, I took the postcard and placed it gently inside the drawer beside the photograph of her as a child. 2 versions of the same love, one from before everything fell apart, and one from after. I smiled at the thought that both were true. Life settled into its rhythm again. I worked mornings at the diner, spent afternoons reading in the library or walking through the park. I had started keeping a list of small joys in my notebook. The sound of coffee pouring into a clean mug, the smell of fresh bread at 7 o'clock in the morning, Ruth humming to herself while watering her plants. A little boy in the diner who always waved at me with both hands. The way the city lights blinked like fireflies when the bus turned the corner at dusk. Every evening, I'd sit by my window, wearing my gray coat even indoors, feeling its weight as a reminder that I belonged to myself again. A week after the postcard, Ruth knocked on my door with 2 mugs of tea. "You've been quiet," she said. "I got a note from my granddaughter," I told her. "That so? Good kid? The best," I said, smiling softly. Ruth nodded, handed me a mug, and sat on the edge of the bed. You think you'll ever go back? To them, I mean. Uh, I stared into the steam rising from the tea. I don't think they'd know what to do with me now. Ruth chuckled. Good. Means you finally grew into your own damn skin. That night, after she went to bed, I thought about what she said. For so many years, I had been smaller on purpose, softer, quieter, hoping to be easier to love. But love that requires you to shrink isn't love. It's control wrapped in kindness. And I was done being controlled. The next morning, I decided to take a walk before work. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue. The world felt freshly washed. I stopped by a small thrift shop that had just opened its doors and found a journal bound in deep green leather. I bought it without hesitation. That evening, after my shift, I sat by the window and began to write not about my family, not about pain, but about life as it was now. The steady kind, the healing kind. There is peace in ordinary days, I wrote. It hides in routines, in warm meals, in friendly silence. It's not dramatic, but it's honest, and that's enough. As the weeks went by, the diner became more than a job. It became a place where I belonged. The regulars smiled when I poured their coffee. Marge, the owner, stopped calling me new girl and started saying our Evelyn. One afternoon, a young woman sat at the counter, tapping nervously at her phone. She couldn't have been older than 30.